Shalom Aleichem, everybody. We're continuing with our series of virtual Divrei Torah. I'd like to start off by wishing all those in need of refuah shlema should have refuah shlema b'karov, and all those in need of a nechama, of a consolation, should have a consolation. This week we read Parshas Naso, which is actually the single largest parsha in the Chumash in terms of psukim. There's 176 psukim in the parsha, and one of the many topics covered in Parshas Naso is the topic of Nazir. A Nazir is a man or a woman who takes a vow to abstain from drinking or ingesting any wine or grape products. They also vow not to cut their hair, to let their hair grow, and they also vow not to come into contact with the dead. And the question is, how does the Torah view someone who takes on these restrictions? So on the one hand, the Torah calls the person a kadosh, right? The Torah says, Kol Yimei Nizro, kadosh hu Hashem. All the days of his Nizirus, the person is kadosh, he is holy unto God, seemingly praising and lauding and viewing the person in a positive light for taking on these extra restrictions upon him or herself. That's on the one hand. Yet on the other hand, the Torah also says that a Nazir brings a karban chatos, he brings a sin offering, seemingly indicating that the Nazir has done something sinful or wrong by taking on these extra restrictions. And so the question is, which one is it? Is he, to borrow the common phrase, is the Nazir a sinner or a saint? Is he a sinner or is he kadosh? Is he holy, holy unto God? This is actually a debate in the Talmud between Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Lazar HaKapar. One opinion emphasizes the Nazir's holiness, and the other one emphasizes his sinfulness for restricting himself unnecessarily in the pleasures of the world, things that God said is permissible. He's going ahead and forbidding upon himself, which this rabbi says, based on the fact that Torah calls him a sinner, he says that's actually a sinful thing to do, to restrict oneself unnecessarily. So the question is, which one is it? So each rabbi, stakes out their position and emphasizes that each one has their particular verse that they emphasize, and answers and explains the other verses in line with their own opinion. But I'd like to suggest that we have a rule in the Gemara, which is Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim. These and these are the words of the living God. Meaning, when we have a debate between rabbis in the Mishnah and the Talmud, we say both opinions have validity to them, and these and those, meaning both opinions, are the words of the living God and are true. So I'd like to apply that rule to our case as follows, meaning I'd like to suggest that really the Nazir is both a sinner and a saint. Both are true. Both opinions are true, and the Nazir is actually both. What do I mean by this? So the Nazir, by restricting himself from things that are permissible, in fact, is going beyond what God restricted the person, and he's taken on extra restrictions. So that, in fact, is kind of extreme behavior, which is viewed negatively. But on the other hand, he's also holy because he presumably, if he's doing his Nazirus for the right reasons, he's taking an appropriate corrective measure. Now, what do I mean by this? Now, the Talmud actually brings in a story. The Talmud says that Shimon HaTzadik, who was a Kohen Gadol during the period of the Bayis Sheni, the Second Temple, as a practice, did not eat the meat from sacrifices that Nazirim, that Nazirs would offer. Except for on one occasion, he saw an exceptionally handsome young man. He had beautiful locks, beautiful curls, and he said to the young man, what did you see fit to destroy your hair? Because after all, after the Nazir allows their hair to grow during the period of Nazirus, but at the end of the process, he's supposed to shave off all of his hair. So Shimon HaTzadik asked this young fellow, you have such nice hair, why did you take upon yourself Nazirus, thereby forcing yourself to actually shave off all your beautiful hair? So the young man responded as follows. He said, I'm a shepherd, and I was pasturing my father's flock, and I came upon my reflection in a river or in a lake bed, and I saw how really very handsome I was, and I was afraid that my evil inclination would get the better of me. So at that point in time, I said, evil inclination, you're not going to get the better of me. I'm going to take upon myself these certain ascetic, restrictive practices of Nazirus, and I'm going to become a Nazir. So upon hearing this, the Gemara records Shimon HaTzadik praised this young man, and he said, may there be many Nazirs like you amongst the Jewish people. Meaning, seemingly, that he was praising him because this young man really took on Nazirus in an appropriate fashion for the right reasons. Meaning, he was afraid that his Yetzer Hara, his evil inclination, his material physical side, was about to get the best of him. And therefore, to counterbalance that, he went to the opposite extreme, to an ascetic, restrictive extreme, taking upon himself the restrictions of Nazir. So in that kind of a situation, Shimon HaTzadik is saying that is absolutely the right thing to do if a person feels themselves in danger of being overwhelmed by their material physical side. So in that kind of a scenario, Nazirus is absolutely appropriate, and that such a person is Kadosh LaHashem, he's holy unto God. So on the one hand, the Nazir, we could say, is a sinner. He's a sinner in the sense that the very fact that he had to go to such an ascetic extreme to begin with indicates a spiritual imbalance in his personality, meaning that he was in danger of getting overwhelmed by his physical material appetites, which is a sinful, or it shows a spiritual imbalance, which indicates a certain sinful tendency, that he was close to becoming an actual sinner. So in that sense, he's a sinner. But having recognized that he has that spiritual imbalance and that he's in danger of being overwhelmed and overcome by his material physical appetites, then he takes appropriate corrective measures by going to the opposite extreme, by restricting himself of even things that God said are actually permissible, right? And going to an ascetic extreme. The Nazir is actually praised and lauded for that move, because under those conditions, it's the appropriate move. We could actually compare it to the analogy of an ill person in terms of taking medicine, right? Medicine is not appropriate, and it could be even harmful to a person who is in balance, who is healthy, they should not take medicine, right? That could even harm them. But if someone is ill and recognizes that fact, then actually he's lauded for doing anything he can do to restore his health, for taking the medicine which can restore his health. So I think the Nazir is both a sinner and a saint, meaning the mere fact that he had to take upon himself this extreme ascetic vow to begin with indicates that there's some spiritual imbalance there to start off with, that he was in danger of having his physical appetites and his yetzer overwhelm him, and in that regard he is a sinner. But having assessed that about oneself or himself or herself, the Nazir is now lauded for taking appropriate corrective action, for taking the spiritual medicine, if you will, of becoming a Nazir. And in that sense, he's Kadosh. So he's a sinner because it indicates a certain spiritual imbalance to start off with, but he's also a saint. He is Kadosh, for if a person recognizes and is honest with himself that truly that is their spiritual state of affairs, then the appropriate action is to go to the other extreme, to take upon oneself a Nazirus, so he could eventually come back to a proper harmonious balance in terms of approaching the material and physical world in a balanced way, in a non-extreme fashion. So I think that perhaps is the resolution to the conundrum. Is a Nazir a sinner or a saint? Is he a kadosh? Or is he a chote? And the answer could be that he's both, as the Torah describes him. He is both a sinner to start off with, but meaning that he's in danger of having his material appetites overwhelm him, but having been honest about that state of affairs and assessing oneself honestly and correctly and accurately, then he takes appropriate corrective measures of going to the opposite extreme, and in that regard, he is a kadosh. He's absolutely doing the right thing by taking the spiritual medicine of Nazirus, and hopefully afterwards he could now, having shifted back to the center, now live a balanced spiritual life without having to go to ascetic extremes and restricting upon himself things that God permitted. So I think that's an important lesson. We all struggle in terms of how to maintain this balance in our own lives between our material side and our spiritual side. And I think the Torah is telling us that really, ideally, a person should not have to go to extremes in terms of restricting himself or herself from things that God said is permissible. Those things that are off the table, which are forbidden, but those things which are permissible, we're allowed to, are there for our pleasure and our enjoyment. God created it that way. But if we feel that sometimes we feel that our material side, our evil inclination, is in danger of getting the better of us. So sometimes it is appropriate to, kind of put certain self-made and self-imposed safeguards on ourselves. So we kind of have bring us back to the centered, proper, balanced approach between our physicality and our spirituality. I think it's an important lesson the Torah is teaching us in this week's parsha, in the parsha of Nazir. Continuing on in the parsha talks about the inauguration of the Mishkan and the fact that the Nesiim, the princes of the 12 tribes of the Jewish people, voluntarily wanted to bring offerings to God and the Mishkan to celebrate the inauguration and the beginning of the functioning of the Mishkan. And they came to Moshe and they approached Moshe and they said, we want to bring these special offerings, even though we were not commanded to do so. We'd like, out of our own excitement and our own spirit of generosity, we'd like to offer these offerings in celebration of the occasion of the inauguration of the Mishkan. And Moshe and Hashem told Moshe, yes, accept these offerings from the Nesiim. I find it very precious, and I'm very happy that they offered it. In fact, the Torah and Hashem is so happy that they offered it that He repeats, even though each of the 12 princes, brought the exact identical offering for each of the first 12 days of the Mishkan's operation, from Rosh Chodesh Nisan until Yud Beis Nisan until 12 Nisan, a different prince, a different tribe, each of the first 12 days of operation. Yet the Torah repeats it over and over again, gives each tribe the play, a full paragraph, even though all 12 offerings were identical, indicating how dear these offerings were to God, by the fact that the Torah gives it so much print and play, if you will, by repeating the same offering over and over again. And the question that arises that we could ask ourselves is, I don't understand what's going on over here. We read several weeks ago in Sefer Vayikra, in Parshas Shmini, about day one of the inauguration, which is Vayihi Bayom HaShmini, was on the 8th day, meaning there were 7 days of practice before the Mishkan started operation. Then on the 8th day, which is Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which was the full, real day of operation, if you will, the day of the actual full day of operation, Nadav Avihu were so excited by this momentous occasion that they brought an offering which they were not commanded to bring, and they were actually struck down by God for bringing this Eish Zara, a foreign fire. They brought an offering, Asher Lo Tziva Osam, that they were not commanded to bring, seemingly indicating that their great offense was that they innovated in the service of the Mishkan, the temple service, and on their own, because of their excitement, innovated and brought an offering that God had not commanded. And God said, no, you have to follow the rules, if you will. Only offerings that I command and things that I want you to do is how you serve me in the Mishkan. There's not really room for freestyling, if you will, when it comes to the service of God in the Mishkan and in the Beis HaMikdash. So how it seems to be a contradiction to the Nisim over here, who also, they were not commanded to bring these offerings. Yet here, God was very excited about their offer to bring karbanos that they were not commanded. So how do we reconcile God's anger when it came to Nadav Avihu with God's joy at the offering of the Nesiim, who were likewise not commanded to bring their offerings, yet they volunteered it out of their own goodwill and excitement at the occasion, and God was very happy that they offered it and accepted it with great joy, to the extent that He gave each tribe and each day, each Karban from a different Nasi, a whole new paragraph, even though it was identical to the previous Nasi. It could have just summed it up in total and saved a lot of space, but it repeated over and over again. So how do we understand the seeming contradiction? So I think the answer is the following, which is it's all how they went about doing it. The Torah says that Nadav Avihu did not ask Moshe and Aaron, did not ask their elders, the leaders of the Jewish people. They just went ahead and did it on their own. In contrast to the Nesiim, it says actually that they brought the offerings to Moshe, and then, meaning they were asking Moshe, can we offer this? They didn't just go ahead and offer this. They first asked the leadership, they asked the rabbinic leadership, they asked Moshe, and then Hashem told Moshe, yes, accept it from them. I'm very pleased that they offered it. I think that's a very important and crucial difference. In fact, the Chazal say that perhaps one of the sins that Nadav Avihu did is, it says, Shahoru halacha b'fnei Moshe Rabbon, that they ruled on a matter of Jewish law in front of their Rebbe, in front of Moshe, who was their Rebbe. Now, where do we see that they ruled on a matter of Jewish law in front of Moshe, the Rebbe? Meaning, perhaps, that they brought the offerings, they decided on their own to bring these offerings without asking Moshe. They ruled on themselves, on their own, without consulting Moshe, who was their Rebbe, who was right there. And for that offense, that's why they were struck dead, according to one opinion of the Midrash, meaning it's all how it was done. Yes, this was a sacrifice which was not commanded by God, and that was a sacrifice that was not commanded by God. But the crucial difference is Nadav Avihu went ahead and acted without consulting the rabbinic leadership, without consulting the Rebbe Moshe Rabbeinu. They just jumped and disregarded the leadership that was there and the Rebbe who was there, and they acted in front of him without consulting him, which is a grave offense. However, when it came to the Nisim, they acted in an appropriate manner. Yes, in other words, God is very pleased with innovation, if you will, and an outpouring of generosity and the spontaneous feeling of wanting to give and celebrate. God is very pleased with that. That's not the issue. The issue is in how it's done. They spontaneously wanted to give something and do something they were not commanded, but before just going ahead and doing it, they said, first we have to ask Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe, we'd like to do this, but what do you think? Is it appropriate? And then Moshe said, I don't know. Let's see what God says. And then God says, okay, yes, Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm very happy they did it. They asked that they did it in the appropriate way. They consulted you. Now let's go ahead and do it and bring these offerings, even though I didn't command them to be offered. I'm very happy at their generous and spontaneous spirit. So it's all how you do it. I think it's also a very important lesson. It could be identical things, right? And coming even from a good place. Nadav Avihu certainly were very great tzaddikim, and they were motivated by love of God in bringing the offering that they brought. But the fact of the matter is, the fact they just jumped in without consulting their Rebbe and just disregarded him as if he was not there, that is a grave offense. Especially people on their level should have known better, and they were punished in a severe fashion. However, the Nesiim also were moved to do something spontaneous and generous out of their own hearts, which God had not commanded them, but they went about it in the appropriate fashion. They said, okay, we have this idea, very excited about it, but let's first bring it to our Rebbe, Moshe Rabbeinu, and ask him, what does he think? And then God told Moshe, yes, okay, Moshe, I'm very pleased that they did it. They went about it in the right fashion. They consulted first. Now we're going to give them the go-ahead, and now we're going to give each of them, not only is it a yes, but it's a yes with flying colors. We're going to give each Nasi its own paragraph, each one of them its own play, verses and verses dedicated to describing the generous offering of the Nisim. So again, very important lesson. Sometimes it's not only the thing that you do, but it's how you do it. It could be a good thing, but if it's done in an inappropriate way, ultimately it could lead to tragic consequences. So I think it's also a very important lesson. Just in conclusion, God willing, this Shabbos, Parshas Naso, we will be, please God, headed back to Shul. And I think it's a very appropriate parsha to restart services again in our Shul, because it describes, as I mentioned, the offerings that were brought at the inauguration of the Mishkan, at the opening, if you will, the opening ceremony of the Mishkan. And our Shul, of course, is a mini Mishkan, is a mini temple, a mini tabernacle. And I think it behooves us to take the lessons to heart. We've been God has made it that because of circumstances that we've unfortunately kicked out of his house for a good couple months. And we've discussed in earlier videos some of the reasons for that, perhaps lack of disrespect for God's sanctuary, talking during services. You're not, like we mentioned, you're not allowed to really speak words, have frivolous conversations. It's called Sicha B'Tela Nishul. Even if it's not in the middle of davening, just davening's over, you're still not allowed to talk. You really shouldn't talk about the Yankee game or the stock market in God's house. That's what the halacha says. So let's thank God we have the privilege of coming back into God's house, of our mini Mishkan. It's a fresh start, just like the Nisim. They were very excited. Let's us be excited, but also let's be cognizant of it's not just a good thing, but we have to do the good thing in the appropriate manner and the way that God dictates, following halacha, having respect for God's house. And in that merit, may we never be kicked out, chas v'shalom, again, and may we not only come back to our shul, which is our mini migdash, our mini mishkan, but in the merit of behaving properly in the mini mishkan, we'll show God that we're ready for the big mishkan, for the Beis HaMikdash, the binyan hashlishi, Beis HaMikdash hashlishi. We should be zocha to bias Mashiach tzidkenu and the building of the third Beis HaMikdash. Meher of Yameinu, Amen. Have a great Shabbos.